Welcome to DeKalb County's Patriots Memorial Park. After it was all said and done, the Vietnam War proved to be our nation's most controversial. Let's take a closer look. The key to understanding our involvement lies with our concern over the spread of communism following World War II. The lessons were clear. Communism led to poverty, enslavement, and often death for those forced to live under its rule. Here's a bit of background. Since the late 1800s, Vietnam, located in Southeast Asia, was controlled by the French and formed part of French Indochina. However, when France surrendered to Germany in 1940, the Japanese took control of this entire area until their own surrender on September 2nd, 1945, ending World War II. Then the French, attempting to reassert their control, faced an independence movement led by Ho Chi Minh, a communist-trained nationalist whose supporters coalesced to establish the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. When war talks broke down in 1946, war resulted. The French controlled the cities but could never regain the countryside, steadily losing ground until their final defeat at Dien Bien Phu in May 1954. Thenceforth, Vietnam was divided into North and South at the 17th parallel, with the expectation that national elections would be held to reunite the country. But these elections never took place. The United States had already provided over $2 billion in aid to the French. When war ensued between the North and South Vietnamese forces, President Harry Truman and his administration felt strongly that America must help any nation threatened by communism. This policy of containment, as it came to be known, was adopted as well by his successors, Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. The war witnessed several distinct periods. From 1957 to 1965, it was mainly a struggle between the South Vietnamese Army and communist-trained South Vietnamese rebels known as the Viet Cong. From 1965 to 1969, North Vietnamese regulars and the United States did much of the fighting, with over 500,000 U.S. troops eventually serving in Vietnam. From 1969 until 1973, the U.S. began to withdraw forces until the ceasefire of 1973. The war ended on April 30th, 1975, when South Vietnam succumbed to North Vietnam. Taking a closer look at U.S. involvement, U.S. advisors began operations in the mid-1950s, helping to advise South Vietnamese forces. But the first American deaths came in July 1959 when guerrillas attacked their living quarters near Saigon. As the war intensified, the North Vietnamese began building supply routes through Laos and Cambodia, which came to be called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In May 1961, President Kennedy sent in 400 Green Beret and authorized secret operations against the Viet Cong. In January 1962, U.S. aircraft began spraying Agent Orange to destroy vegetation which would feed and/or provide cover for guerrilla forces. In August 1964, the USS Maddox, on an espionage mission, was attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, resulting in Congress passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing the President to take all necessary measures, including armed force, against any aggressor. In March 1965, President Lyndon Johnson launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a 3-year bombing campaign over North Vietnamese cities and the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In the first large-scale U.S. battle in November 1965, American forces fought to a standstill in the La Drang Valley. 2 years later, in the Battle of Dak To, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces resisted a communist assault in the central highlands of South Vietnam. However, in January 1968, The North launched attacks in over 100 cities in what came to be known as the Tet Offensive. Even though Allied forces soon regained control and inflicted heavy losses on the North Vietnamese, the extent of the attacks sent shockwaves back home among the American people. At the same time, a U.S. Marine garrison at the Quai Son resisted a massive bombardment by Communist forces. On the positive side, U.S. forces won battles at Hue and Saigon, clearing them of Viet Cong guerrillas. In May 1969, in the Battle of Apia Mountain, American paratroopers attacked entrenched North Vietnamese fighters in an attempt to cut off North Vietnamese infiltration through Laos. The cost to secure the area was so high, journalists named the site Hamburger Hill. Soon thereafter, President Richard Nixon began drawing down American troop numbers under the policy known as Vietnamization, and with South Vietnam's ARVN, which shouldered the bulk of the fighting. By 1972, the number of remaining U.S. forces was 69,000, from a high of 549,000 in 1969. On January 27, 1973, President Nixon signed the Paris Peace Accords, ending American military involvement in Vietnam. By April 1975, the last remaining holdout, Saigon, was captured by the North Vietnamese. The U.S. was forced to airlift remaining personnel and 7,000 South Vietnamese refugees in an heroic 18-hour evacuation. This most difficult and controversial war had finally ended for the U.S., but communist retribution and killing would continue for some time after. On behalf of all of us here in DeKalb County, Alabama, we want to thank you for having come to Patriots Memorial Park. And as we've said before, we hope that you will go away not only with a deeper appreciation for those who have served, but perhaps also with a heart to serve in your community, in our military, as a first responder, there where you live, or with the U.S. military around the world. Thank you for coming.